Berlin, East Germany, February 1956. 600 feet beneath Soviet-controlled territory, American engineers sit in a climate-controlled chamber listening to Soviet military communications in real time. Above them, Red Army units patrol the streets, KGB officers monitor Western activity, and East German police enforce strict border controls. The Americans are invisible, their presence completely undetected. They arrived not by infiltration through checkpoints or dangerous border crossings, but by digging. For 18 months, the CIA has operated a tunnel stretching from West Berlin deep into Soviet territory, tapping directly into critical Soviet military telephone cables. The operation required excavating 1,476 feet of tunnel, removing 3,100 tons of soil without Soviet detection, and maintaining absolute secrecy while construction teams worked 24 hours daily. This is the story of Operation Gold, the most ambitious signals, intelligence penetration of the Cold War, an engineering marvel that required thinking like miners while operating like spies. Berlin in 1945 emerged from World War II as the physical manifestation of Cold War division. The victorious Allied powers partitioned the city into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, each administered independently while surrounded by Soviet-controlled East Germany. The western sectors formed an isolated democratic island 110 miles inside communist territory, connected to West Germany by narrow transportation corridors the Soviets could sever at will. Soviet military headquarters in Karlshorst operated openly, coordinating Red Army forces throughout Eastern Europe. Soviet communications flowed through the city constantly: military orders, logistics coordination, strategic planning, all traveling via telephone cables buried beneath streets in the Soviet sector. For American intelligence, Berlin represented both the front line of ideological confrontation and a unique collection environment where adversary communications passed within reach, if only methods could be developed to access them. The CIA's Berlin operations base pursued traditional human intelligence operations throughout the early 1950s, recruiting agents, running safe houses, and attempting to penetrate Soviet military and political organizations. The results were limited. Soviet counterintelligence was sophisticated and ruthless. Agents who attempted contact with Soviet personnel faced arrest, interrogation, and execution. By 1952, CIA technical officers recognized that human intelligence alone could not provide the comprehensive understanding of Soviet military capabilities that strategic planning required. The solution emerged from a different discipline entirely: signals intelligence, the interception and analysis of communications, offered access that human agents could not achieve. Soviet military units communicated constantly via telephone, coordinating movements, reporting equipment status, and transmitting orders. Those communications traveled through underground cables that ran through Soviet-controlled territory in East Berlin. If those cables could be tapped, the intelligence yield would be comprehensive and continuous. The challenge was obvious. The cables were buried 18 inches underground in territory patrolled by Soviet security forces. Any attempt to access them on the surface would be detected immediately. The solution required thinking beyond traditional espionage. If agents could not safely access Soviet communications, and if those communications traveled through cables buried beneath Soviet-controlled territory, the answer was not infiltration. It was excavation. Between 1952 and 1953, CIA technical officers and British MI6 engineers developed plans for an operation unlike anything attempted in intelligence history. The British had successfully executed a similar operation in Vienna, Operation Silver, where MI6 had tapped Soviet communication cables by tunneling from a building in the British sector. The Vienna operation proved the concept was technically feasible. Berlin offered a far more ambitious opportunity. The target was a cluster of Soviet military telephone cables running beneath Schonefelder Chaussee in the Alt-Glienicke district of East Berlin. Intelligence indicated these cables carried communications from Soviet headquarters in Karlshorst to military units throughout East Germany and into the Soviet Union. Tapping those cables would provide access to strategic military communications at unprecedented scale. The technical requirements were formidable. The tunnel would need to extend approximately 1,500 feet from an entry point in the American sector of West Berlin into Soviet territory. It would need to descend deep enough to avoid detection by seismic sensors or routine construction work. It would require absolute silence during excavation to prevent Soviet listening posts from detecting digging activity. The excavated soil, 3,100 tons of it, would need to be removed and disposed of without raising suspicion. Air circulation systems would be necessary to prevent asphyxiation. Water infiltration would require constant pumping. The tunnel would need steel reinforcement to prevent collapse. At the terminus, a chamber would house recording equipment and technical operators working rotating shifts. The operation would require cover, a plausible explanation for construction activity, heavy equipment movement, and the presence of American military personnel at a site near the Soviet sector border. CIA officers selected a location in the Rudow district of West Berlin, approximately 1,200 feet from the target cables. The cover story was straightforward. A warehouse would be constructed, ostensibly to house radar equipment for the U.S. Air Force. The building would provide concealment for the vertical shaft that would serve as the tunnel entrance. Construction of a military facility near the border was unremarkable. Soviet observers would notice, investigate through routine intelligence channels, and conclude the Americans were building exactly what they claimed to be building. The radar equipment would even be installed and operated to maintain authenticity. Beneath the warehouse, engineers would excavate the actual operation. By late 1953, planning was complete. Engineers had calculated load-bearing requirements for the tunnel structure. Equipment had been procured. Specialized mechanical diggers modified for silent operation, air circulation systems, water pumps, recording devices. German construction contractors had been hired for the warehouse, told they were building a radar facility, unaware of the tunnel beneath. Security protocols were established. Only personnel with specific operational need would know the tunnel's true purpose. Even workers excavating the tunnel would operate in compartmentalized teams, each aware only of their specific task. Construction began in February 1954 with excavation of a vertical shaft beneath the warehouse in Rudow. The shaft descended 28 feet, reaching the depth necessary for horizontal tunnel construction. Engineers worked in shifts, removing soil in buckets hauled to the surface by mechanical winch. The excavated material posed immediate security challenges. Soil removal had to appear consistent with normal construction activity. Trucks departed the site at night, mixing tunnel soil with construction debris from the warehouse above, transporting it to disposal sites scattered across West Berlin. Soviet observers monitoring the construction site saw precisely what they expected to see: a military facility being built with the usual mess and inefficiency of American construction projects. Once the vertical shaft reached proper depth, horizontal excavation began. The tunnel would extend 1,476 feet from the shaft toward the Soviet cable location in Alt-Glienicke. Engineers used modified mechanical diggers equipped with rubber padding and sound dampening to minimize noise. Excavation advanced approximately 15 feet per day, slow by mining standards, but extraordinary for covert operations where silence was mandatory. The soil in Berlin was primarily sand with clay deposits, favorable for tunneling, but prone to collapse without proper support. As excavation progressed, construction crews installed steel liner plates along the tunnel walls and ceiling, creating a rigid structure capable of withstanding the weight of soil and buildings above. The tunnel diameter measured 6 feet, sufficient for personnel movement and equipment installation, but small enough to minimize excavation volume. Air circulation systems pumped fresh air from the surface through concealed vents, preventing carbon dioxide buildup that would render the tunnel uninhabitable. Water infiltration was constant. Berlin's water table sat close to the surface, and groundwater seeped continuously through soil and liner plate joints. Pumps operated constantly, moving water back to the surface where it was discharged into Berlin's sewer system. Workers operated in confined claustrophobic conditions. Shifts rotated every 8 hours. The psychological demands were significant. Men working hundreds of feet underground in a tunnel that would collapse if structural integrity failed, performing work that would result in execution if Soviet forces discovered them. Operational security required complete compartmentalization. Workers did not know the tunnel's ultimate purpose. By January 1955, excavation had progressed to within feet of the target location. The final phase required extraordinary precision. CIA technical officers used sensitive electromagnetic detection equipment to locate the exact position of Soviet telephone cables buried 18 inches below the surface in East Berlin. The tunnel had to terminate directly beneath those cables without breaching the surface or alerting Soviet security forces patrolling above. Engineers constructed a chamber at the tunnel terminus, a room approximately 10 feet square where recording equipment would be installed and technical officers would operate. The chamber was climate-controlled to protect sensitive electronics and provide bearable working conditions for operators who would spend hours monitoring Soviet communications. The cables themselves posed the final technical challenge. Tapping telephone lines requires physical access, but cutting into Soviet military cables would interrupt service immediately and trigger investigation. CIA technical officers developed non-invasive inductive taps, devices that detected electrical signals passing through cables without physically breaching the insulation. The taps were positioned carefully around 3 main cable bundles, each carrying hundreds of individual telephone circuits. Installation required penetrating the soil above the tunnel terminus, reaching up 18 inches to where Soviet cables ran, and attaching the taps without disturbing cable function or alerting Soviet technicians monitoring line quality. By February 1955, construction was complete. The tunnel stretched 1,476 feet from West Berlin into Soviet territory, terminating 18 inches beneath critical Soviet telephone cables. American technical officers had excavated, concealed, and successfully positioned themselves to intercept the communications of their primary adversary. On May 11, 1955, CIA technical officers in the tunnel chamber activated recording equipment connected to Soviet military telephone cables. The taps functioned perfectly. Soviet communications flowed through the cables uninterrupted, while American recorders captured every conversation simultaneously. The volume was staggering. The 3 cable bundles carried communications for Soviet military headquarters, KGB operations in East Germany, and administrative traffic for occupation forces. Conversations were continuous, officers coordinating troop movements, logistics, personnel tracking equipment deliveries, intelligence officers discussing surveillance operations. Recording operations required sophisticated coordination. Approximately 50 CIA and military intelligence personnel rotated through the tunnel on shifts, monitoring equipment, changing recording tapes, and maintaining climate control and power systems. The recording equipment itself was state-of-the-art for the period. Ampex tape recorders, modified for continuous operation, capable of capturing multiple telephone circuits simultaneously. Each day produced hundreds of hours of recordings that were packaged, transported to West Berlin intelligence facilities, and forwarded to processing centers in London and Washington. The analysis challenge exceeded even the collection challenge. Soviet communications were in Russian, requiring hundreds of translators. Conversations were often technical, discussing military equipment, unit designations, and operational procedures that required specialist knowledge to interpret. By August 1955, 3 months into operations, American intelligence had collected approximately 443,000 conversations, totaling over 6 million hours of recorded communications. The intelligence yield was unprecedented in volume, but varied in significance. Much of the intercepted traffic was routine, logistical coordination, personnel transfers, equipment maintenance reports. This routine traffic provided detailed understanding of Soviet military operations at tactical level. Analysts could track Soviet tank regiment locations, identify artillery battery deployments, and map command relationships. The order of battle intelligence was extraordinarily detailed. The tunnel also captured communications revealing Soviet equipment problems, training deficiencies, and morale issues. Conversations between officers complained about poor maintenance, inadequate supplies, and problematic relationships with East German counterparts. This intelligence indicated that while Soviet forces in East Germany were large and well-equipped, operational effectiveness was constrained by systematic problems that reduced combat readiness. The tunnel's intelligence value became subject to debate that continues decades later. CIA assessments during operation emphasized the unprecedented access to Soviet military communications, but retrospective analysis revealed significant limitations. Much of the intelligence was tactical rather than strategic, unit movements and equipment status rather than high-level policy decisions. The most sensitive Soviet communications traveled via encrypted radio or secure courier, not vulnerable telephone lines. Strategic intelligence requires access to leadership deliberations, strategic intentions, and long-term planning. The tunnel accessed communications Soviet security considered sufficiently routine to risk on landlines. Despite limitations, the operation continued through summer and fall of 1955 and into early 1956. Recording equipment operated continuously. The tunnel had become a production operation, no longer an experiment, but an established intelligence source. What CIA officers did not know was that Soviet intelligence had been aware of the tunnel since its conception, informed by a British intelligence officer who attended the initial planning meetings. George Blake, MI6's liaison to the CIA for the Berlin Tunnel Project, was a Soviet agent. On April 22, 1956, Soviet and East German engineers investigating reported telephone cable malfunctions in Alt-Glienicke discovered an underground chamber containing American recording equipment. The discovery was not accidental. Soviet intelligence had monitored the tunnel's construction and operation for over 2 years, allowing the operation to continue while protecting Blake's position within British intelligence. When the KGB determined Blake's continued cover had provided maximum intelligence benefit, they authorized exposure of the tunnel. Soviet engineers, accompanied by security forces, excavated the area above the tunnel terminus and broke through into the chamber. They found sophisticated recording equipment, comfortable furnishings, and clear evidence of long-term American presence. CIA technical officers in the tunnel heard Soviet voices and equipment noise coming from the chamber. Evacuation procedures activated immediately. Personnel in the tunnel withdrew through the access shaft, equipment was powered down, and the facility was abandoned. There was no time for sanitization, no possibility of removing equipment or destroying evidence. Within hours, Soviet authorities convened press conferences, to announce the discovery and exploit it for propaganda purposes. Soviet officials portrayed the tunnel as evidence of American aggression. The facility was opened for tours. Over the following weeks, approximately 90,000 East Germans and Soviet citizens visited the tunnel. Western media coverage was extensive. The New York Times and other major outlets reported the discovery, generally treating it as evidence of CIA boldness and ingenuity rather than as an intelligence failure. But privately, CIA officers struggled to understand how the tunnel had been compromised. The construction had been executed with extraordinary security. Investigations began immediately, but found nothing. What CIA investigators did not yet know was that George Blake had informed Soviet intelligence of the tunnel during planning stages in 1953. Blake had been recruited by the KGB years earlier while serving as an MI6 officer in Korea, where he was captured during the Korean War and subjected to sophisticated ideological recruitment. When he returned to British service, he was a committed Soviet agent. His assignment as MI6 liaison to CIA operations in Berlin gave him comprehensive access to Western intelligence activities, including the tunnel project. Blake attended planning meetings, reviewed technical specifications, and new construction timelines. He reported everything to his Soviet handlers. The KGB faced a decision. Exposing the tunnel immediately would protect Soviet communications, but would also compromise Blake, whose access to British intelligence operations was far more valuable than denying Americans access to tactical military telephone calls. The KGB calculated that Blake's continued operation justified allowing the tunnel to function. The intelligence Blake provided about broader Western operations outweighed the tactical disadvantage of Americans listening to routine military communications. Soviet leadership, including Khrushchev, approved the decision to allow the tunnel to operate while monitoring its activities. Blake's role remained unknown to Western intelligence for 5 more years. In 1961, a Polish intelligence officer who defected to the West provided information that led British counterintelligence to Blake. He was arrested, interrogated, and eventually confessed to years of espionage for the Soviet Union. His betrayals extended far beyond the Berlin Tunnel. Blake had compromised numerous MI6 operations, exposed British agents operating in Eastern Europe, and provided Soviet intelligence with comprehensive understanding of Western intelligence capabilities and methods. Some of the agents Blake betrayed were executed. Blake was tried and sentenced to 42 years imprisonment. He served 5 years before escaping from Wormwood Scrubs prison in 1966 and fleeing to the Soviet Union, where he lived until his death in 2020. The tunnel's exposure created operational challenges and political consequences. CIA's immediate assessment treated the operation as a success despite discovery. For 11 months, American intelligence had accessed Soviet military communications at unprecedented scale. The intelligence gathered, while limited in strategic significance, provided comprehensive tactical understanding of Soviet military organization in East Germany. The operation demonstrated technical capability and operational audacity that enhanced CIA's reputation. Public relations impact was generally favorable. CIA Director Alan Dulles considered the operation a significant achievement, but internally, CIA counterintelligence officers questioned operational security. When Blake's role was revealed in 1961, the full scope of compromise became clear. The operation CIA had considered a success had been monitored by Soviet intelligence from inception. Every aspect of construction, every technical capability, every operational procedure had been known to the adversary. The intelligence collected was not the product of successful covert penetration, but of Soviet decision to allow collection while protecting a more valuable source. CIA's relationship with MI6 was strained. Blake had been British officer. His recruitment and operation the result of British security failures. American operations had been compromised by Allies' penetration. The revelation forced reassessment of intelligence sharing protocols. Soviet responses to the tunnel went beyond propaganda exploitation. Cable security was enhanced throughout Soviet-controlled territories. Encryption increased for sensitive communications. The improvements made subsequent signals intelligence collection more difficult. Blake's betrayal forced intelligence services to confront uncomfortable realities about operational security. The operation demonstrated that technical penetrations of adversary communications required not only engineering sophistication, but also operational security at human level. Subsequent operations incorporated more rigorous compartmentalization and enhanced vetting procedures. The tunnel's technical innovations in silent excavation, non-invasive cable tapping, and long-term underground operations informed later collection efforts. The operation validated investment in signals intelligence infrastructure and encouraged development of increasingly sophisticated collection methods. The Berlin Tunnel became both template and cautionary tale for subsequent Cold War intelligence operations. Technical innovations demonstrated during the tunnel's construction influenced covert engineering projects for decades. Operational security lessons were equally significant. The tunnel demonstrated that compartmentalization and need-to-know principles required rigorous enforcement. Blake's access to comprehensive operational details created vulnerability that ultimately compromised the entire operation. Subsequent intelligence operations incorporated more restrictive information sharing, even with allied services. Public exposure of the tunnel created precedent for intelligence operations becoming public knowledge. The tunnel's exposure demonstrated that even sophisticated operations could not assume permanent secrecy. This reality influenced operational planning, encouraging designs that could withstand public disclosure without catastrophic consequences. The tunnel became subject of books, films, and academic studies examining Cold War espionage. It captured public imagination as symbol of the lengths adversaries would pursue to gain advantage in ideological struggle. Modern intelligence operations face similar challenges in different technological contexts. Cyber operations targeting adversary communications networks require analogous thinking, finding ways to access information that adversaries believe is secure. The tensions between technical capability and human security that defined the tunnel operation remain central to contemporary intelligence work. The lesson that human penetration can compromise even the most sophisticated technical operations remains relevant. The Berlin Tunnel embodies contradictions that define Cold War intelligence operations. The operation succeeded in constructing an impossible tunnel, excavating beneath hostile territory without detection, installing sophisticated collection equipment, and gathering unprecedented volumes of communications. It succeeded technically while failing strategically, known to the adversary from inception, yet allowed to operate to protect more valuable source. The engineering was excellent. The tradecraft was sophisticated. The security was compromised. These contradictory realities coexisted without negating each other. The tunnel worked exactly as designed. It accomplished exactly what engineers and technical officers intended. But it operated within context they did not understand, monitored by adversary they believed was unaware. Success and failure were not sequential. They were simultaneous. The operation imposed risks on local populations. German contractors working on the warehouse, innocent civilians living near the tunnel route, all faced potential danger from operation they had no role in authorizing. Blake's betrayals created human costs that extended far beyond the tunnel. British agents he exposed were arrested, interrogated, and in some cases executed by Soviet security forces. The question of whether the tunnel contributed to preventing war or escalating tensions remains unanswerable. Intelligence operations exist in ambiguous space, where success is measured by what does not happen as much as by what does. Did the intelligence gathered from the tunnel inform decisions that prevented miscalculation? Did Soviet knowledge of American technical capabilities deter aggressive actions or encourage more sophisticated security measures? Both outcomes are plausible. Neither is provable. The Berlin Tunnel operation succeeded in constructing an impossible tunnel, collecting unprecedented communications, and demonstrating technical ingenuity. It failed to prevent its own compromise, access most valuable intelligence, or justify its costs when measured against actual strategic impact. The contradiction was not failure of planning or execution, but fundamental limitation of technical operations in human conflict. The tunnel could reach Soviet cables. It could not reach Soviet thinking. It could intercept communications. It could not intercept intentions. The paradox was complete. Everything worked as designed, while nothing worked as hoped. The tunnel was both monument to intelligence capability and memorial to intelligence limitations, a perfect symbol of Cold War espionage where technical excellence coexisted with strategic uncertainty, where allies were simultaneously essential and dangerous, and where success and failure became indistinguishable in the darkness beneath divided Berlin. If this journey into Cold War engineering, signals intelligence, and the paradoxes of technical espionage captivated you, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss when we investigate the operations that defined intelligence history. Drop a like if you value the research behind reconstructing these remarkable stories. And here's your question for the comments. Could a similar tunnel operation succeed today, or has modern surveillance technology made such physical penetrations obsolete? Are cyber operations the new tunnels, or do they face the same human security vulnerabilities that compromised Operation Gold? Let's debate that in the comments.